The boardroom on the 43rd floor of Meridian Tower had a particular kind of silence, the kind that wasn't peaceful at all, but deliberate, constructed. The silence of people who had decided, before you walked through the door, exactly how much space you were allowed to occupy. Stewart Aldridge noticed it the moment he stepped off the elevator. He was wearing the same gray wool blazer he'd owned for 11 years. It had been relined twice, once by a tailor in Sudbury, and once by his daughter, who had learned to sew specifically because she knew he would never replace it. His watch was a Seiko analog with a hairline crack across the crystal that he'd never had fixed. He carried no briefcase, only a single manila folder, slightly bent at one corner, tucked under his left arm. The receptionist had looked at him the way people sometimes looked at delivery drivers who'd taken a wrong turn. He hadn't corrected her impression. Stewart Aldridge had spent 41 years not correcting people's impressions. It was, in a way, his greatest professional skill. The Whitfield group had requested this meeting. That detail mattered, though nobody in the room seemed to remember it now. Across the long glass table sat 4 people. Reginald Whitfield, 72, the patriarch, who had built his development empire the old way, inherited land, leveraged debt, and strategic marriages. Beside him sat his son, Douglas Whitfield, 44, who managed the company's acquisitions and carried the particular impatience of a man who had been promised the throne his entire life and was still waiting. To Douglas's left was a woman named Carolyn Mercer, the family's legal counsel, who had worked for the Whitfields for 18 years and had learned to read the room before she entered it. And at the far end, barely looking up from her phone, was Douglas's wife, Tamsin Whitfield, who attended these meetings not because she had a formal role but because she had learned, early in her marriage, that the moment you stopped showing up was the moment they forgot to include you. Stewart sat down across from them. He set the manila folder on the table. He did not open it. Reginald Whitfield looked at him the way old men with old money sometimes looked at the world, with a patience that was indistinguishable from contempt. "Mr. Aldridge," he said, "thank you for making the time." "Of course," Stewart said. There was a pause. Douglas glanced at the folder, then back at Stewart's jacket, then at Carolyn Mercer. "We've had a chance to review the preliminary valuation on Aldridge Environmental," Douglas said. His voice had the brisk efficiency of a man who considered small talk a form of weakness. 47 million. That's the number our people landed on. "That's one number," Stewart said. Douglas smiled the way people smile when they've decided to be patient. "It's a fair number. Given the size of the operation, the geographic footprint, the client concentration. The client concentration is in the public sector," Stewart said. 17 municipal contracts, 4 provincial, 1 federal. That's not concentration, that's stability. Carolyn Mercer made a small note on her legal pad. Reginald hadn't moved. "We're not disputing the contracts," Douglas said. "We're pointing out that public sector work has ceiling limitations. You can't grow at the rate a private equity structure would allow." "I'm not looking to grow at a private equity rate," Stewart said. The room went quiet again, but this was a different kind of quiet, less constructed, more uncertain. Douglas leaned forward slightly. "Then what are you looking for, Mr. Aldridge?" Stewart looked at him for a moment before he answered. "Not a long look. Just long enough. I'm trying to understand what you're looking for," he said. "You called this meeting." Stewart Aldridge had started Aldridge Environmental Solutions in 1987, in a rented office above a hardware store in Timmins, Ontario. He was 26 years old, had $2,000 in a personal checking account, and had recently left a position as a junior field technician with a company that no longer existed. The work in those years was unglamorous in every possible sense: soil remediation on contaminated industrial sites, groundwater sampling in communities where the wells had gone bad, environmental assessments on properties that banks wouldn't touch, the kind of work that needed doing and that nobody particularly wanted to talk about at dinner parties. He had done it anyway. His first employee was a man named Terrence, who drove a truck with a broken heater and never complained about it. His second was a woman named Ruth, who had a chemistry degree and could calculate contaminant gradients faster than any machine Stewart had seen. He paid them on time, every 2 weeks, even in the months when that meant he didn't pay himself. He had a daughter, Maggie. Her mother had left when Maggie was 4, not cruelly, not dramatically, just quietly and with exhaustion, to a man in Vancouver who offered a different life. Stewart had not blamed her. He had also not fallen apart. There was too much to do. Maggie grew up in the office in the back seat of the truck, on job sites wearing a hard hat that was 3 sizes too large. She learned to read soil remediation reports before she learned to drive. By the time she was 12, she could tell you the difference between Phase 1 and Phase 2 environmental assessments without hesitation. She was 31 now, living in Guelph with her partner and a dog named Brunswick. She called him every Sunday. He thought about calling her from the elevator on the way up to the 43rd floor. He had decided not to. He didn't want to worry her. Aldridge Environmental had, over 37 years, become something the industry recognized even if the general public didn't. 112 employees, offices in 4 provinces, a remediation division, an assessment division, and a newer division that focused on environmental monitoring for infrastructure projects, pipelines, highways, transit corridors. The revenue was not the kind that made headlines. It was the kind that compounded quietly, like interest in a savings account. The Whitfields had been circling for 2 years. They weren't the first. There had been an approach from a Calgary firm in 2019, a soft inquiry from an American environmental consultancy in 2021, and a more formal letter of intent from an infrastructure fund in 2022 that had dissolved before anything was signed. Stewart had looked at all of them. He had asked questions. He had listened carefully to what they said and, more carefully, to what they didn't. What the Whitfields wanted, he had understood from the first letter, was not Aldridge Environmental's expertise. They wanted its contracts, its government relationships, the access that came with 37 years of showing up on time and doing the work properly. They wanted to attach their name to it. He had known this for 2 years. He had come to this meeting anyway. There was a reason for that. He hadn't shared it yet. "Let me be direct," Douglas said after a coffee service arrived and was largely ignored. "Please," Stewart said. "The Whitfield Group is prepared to offer $52 million for full acquisition of Aldridge Environmental Solutions, including all intellectual property, existing contracts, and employee agreements. We would retain current management in transitional roles for a period of 18 months. He paused, after which integration into Whitfield's infrastructure division would be complete. Stewart said nothing. "That's a significant premium over our initial valuation," Carolyn added. 13% above the 47. "I heard the number," Stewart said. "Mr. Aldridge." Reginald's voice came from the far end of the table, slower than his son's, heavier. "You've built something real, nobody in this disputes that. But the industry is changing. Climate legislation, federal reporting requirements, the transition mandates, these are going to demand scale that a privately held operation your size cannot sustain indefinitely." It was, Stewart thought, a reasonable argument, carefully assembled, probably prepared by someone other than Reginald, who hadn't run the operational details of anything in years. "What would transitional roles look like?" Stewart asked. Douglas glanced at Carolyn. "You would retain the title of founder and senior advisor. You'd consult on complex legacy projects and client relationships during the integration period." "Consult," Stewart repeated. "With full compensation, of course, a generous advisory retainer, and after 18 months, a small silence." "The integration would be complete," Douglas said again. Same words, slightly different weight. Tamsin Whitfield finally put her phone down. She looked at Stewart with the frank appraisal of someone who had stopped bothering to disguise her opinions. He reminded her, she was thinking, of her uncle in Muskoka, quiet in a way that she'd never been able to decide was wisdom or stubbornness. She had come to think it was usually both. "What's in the folder?" she asked. Everyone at the table looked at her. She didn't acknowledge them. Stewart looked at Tamsin for a moment, then he almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that the shape of it registered. "An offer," he said. The trouble with the Whitfields, and Stewart had spent considerable time considering this on early mornings when Brunswick County had not yet woken up, and the only sound was the coffee maker cycling through, was not that they were dishonest. They weren't, particularly. They were transactional in the way that large families with large holdings tend to become. Efficiency had replaced intention somewhere along the way, and nobody had noticed, because efficiency is easier to justify. But a transaction was not what Aldridge Environmental needed. 112 people had built their lives around that company. Terrence, who was 63 now, and still drove a truck but a newer one with a working heater. Ruth, who had left and come back twice and was now director of science. The 23 people in the monitoring division who had been hired in the last 4 years, who had student loans and rental apartments and retirement savings that were barely started. Stewart had thought about them every time someone had approached with a letter of intent. He had thought about them more carefully this time, because this time he had done something the other times had not prompted him to do. He had made his own move first. "An offer," Douglas said slowly. "You're here to make us an offer." "I'm here to respond to yours," Stewart said. "But yes, I have something to put on the table." He opened the manila folder. Inside was a single document, 12 pages, bound with a simple clip. He slid it across the glass to Douglas, who picked it up with the careful skepticism of a man who did not like surprises. "Aldridge Environmental is not for sale," Stewart said. "Not in the way you've structured this. But I've spent the last 8 months working with a financing group on an alternative arrangement." Douglas had started reading. His expression was difficult to interpret. "An employee ownership trust," Stewart continued, "registered under federal legislation. The company transitions to partial employee ownership over a 7-year period, 49% to the trust, with the remaining equity retained by a holding structure I'll continue to manage. Revenue-sharing provisions, board representation for employee trustees, locked-in operational continuity." The room was very still. "The financing group," Stewart said, "has committed $61 million in structured debt to facilitate the transition, which means the company's balance sheet is stronger after the trust is established than it is today." Carolyn Mercer had stopped writing. Reginald Whitfield was looking at Stewart with an expression that had shifted. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. He was a man who had seen a great many deals in 72 years. He recognized when he saw it the shape of someone who had come to the table already holding something. "Who is the financing group?" Douglas asked. His voice was careful now. "Flattened. A consortium," Stewart said. "Pension funds, primarily. They prefer not to be named in preliminary discussions. You've been in discussions with pension funds for 8 months." "Yes." Douglas set the document down. He looked at his father. Reginald looked back at him. Tamsin Whitfield, at the far end of the table, picked up her coffee cup and took a slow, unhurried sip. "You came here," Douglas said, "knowing you were going to say no." "I came here," Stewart said, "to tell you what yes would look like from our side. If the Whitfield Group wanted to participate in the trust structure as a minority partner with defined governance rights and a 5-year revenue participation, there's a conversation to be had. But a full acquisition with an 18-month transition to dissolution." He paused. "That's not a conversation I can have. You're turning down $52 million, Douglas said. "I'm declining a specific structure," Stewart said. The amount was never really the point. He left the building at 10 minutes past noon. The October air on Bay Street was the kind of cold that comes before the real cold. A warning, not a threat. Stewart walked to where he'd parked the car, a 2009 Subaru Forester that his daughter had told him on 3 separate occasions he should replace. The rear bumper had a dent from a parking lot in Sudbury in 2018. He hadn't fixed that either. He sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes without starting the engine. He was not, in that moment, thinking about the meeting. He was thinking about a job site in 1993, outside Kirkland Lake, where the ground had been so contaminated by decades of improper waste disposal that the first core samples had come back almost black. The community had lived with it for 20 years. A provincial fund had covered the remediation work, barely, and it had taken 3 years and 22 of his people to do it properly. He had never made money on that job. They'd come in underpriced and overcommitted, and there had been months where he'd wondered if the company would survive it, but the wells had come back clean. He had the final testing report still, in a binder in his office in Timmins. He looked at it occasionally, when he needed to remember what the point was. He thought the Whitfields had probably never understood what the point was. That wasn't a judgment, particularly. It was just a difference in what the work meant. He started the engine and pulled out into traffic. He called Maggie from the highway, when he was past the city and the lanes had opened up. "How did it go?" she asked. She'd known about the meeting. He hadn't told her the details, but she'd known. "It went fine," he said. "Dad, it went the way I expected it to go. Did they offer you something ridiculous?" "They offered me something reasonable," he said. "It just wasn't the right thing." He heard the dog bark in the background, Brunswick lunging at something in the yard. "Are you okay?" Maggie asked. He thought about the question. Outside, the highway cut through stands of birch and spruce, the northern edge of cottage country giving way to something rawer. The sky was a flat, serious gray, the kind that meant the season was settling in for real. "Yeah," he said. "I'm good. You should come for dinner this weekend. I'll see about the drive." "Dad, it's 2 hours." "I know. I'll see about the drive." She made a sound that was half exasperated, half fond, a sound she had been making at him for most of her life. He found it, as always, quietly reassuring. What Stewart had not told the Whitfields, what he had not told anyone except the financing consortium and his own board, in a meeting that had lasted 7 hours and ended with Ruth crying, which was the most surprising thing he'd seen in a decade, was that the employee trust had not been his original idea. It had come from an envelope. In the spring of 2 years ago, he had received a letter, paper, handwritten, with a return address in Prince Edward Island that he didn't recognize. The letter was from a man named Callum Price, who turned out to be the son of a woman named Dorothy Price, who had worked for Aldridge Environmental from 1991 to 2014, 23 years, in the Sudbury office as an administrative coordinator. Dorothy had died in March of that year. She was 71. Callum had written because, while settling his mother's estate, he had found a folder. Inside the folder were pay stubs, performance reviews, and a handwritten note that Dorothy had kept. Not filed, but kept, folded inside the cover of the folder, from a letter Stewart had written to all his employees in 2009, during the financial crisis, when the company was under real strain, and he had told everyone, honestly, that the next 12 months were uncertain, but that he had no intention of reducing the workforce, and that if it came to cuts, they would start from the top. They hadn't needed to make cuts. But Dorothy had kept the letter. Callum wrote that his mother had spoken about the company, the way some people speak about a place they had loved genuinely. Not perfectly, but genuinely. That she had felt, in her years there, that the work mattered, and that she mattered to it. He had written simply to say thank you. He hadn't wanted anything. Stewart had read the letter 3 times, sitting at his kitchen table in the early morning, and then he had put it in the same binder as the Kirkland Lake remediation report. He had started thinking about the trust the following week. By the time November came, the Whitfields had issued a revised proposal. It arrived via Carolyn Mercer's office, a formal letter, careful in its language, suggesting that the Whitfield Group would be open to exploring a minority participation structure in the employee ownership trust, provided certain governance terms could be negotiated. Stewart read it on a Tuesday afternoon in his office in Timmins, with his coat still on because the building's heating system had been unreliable since September. Terrence knocked on the doorframe and handed him a coffee without being asked, which was something Terrence did when he sensed a document that required thinking about. Stewart read it twice. "Well?" Terrence said from the doorway. "They're interested in the partnership structure." Terrence considered this. He had been with the company for 36 years. He had opinions about the Whitfields, which he had expressed, with characteristic brevity, in a single sentence when Stewart had first told him about the acquisition approach. "They want the name on the door, not the dirt on the boots." "What are you going to tell them?" Terrence asked. Stewart set the letter down. He looked out the window at the street below, a Tuesday afternoon in Timmins in November, gray and specific, a delivery truck idling outside the pharmacy across the road. "I'm going to tell them the terms," he said. "And if they don't like the terms, then they don't like the terms." Terrence picked up his coffee mug, his own, not the one he'd brought, and considered this for a moment. "I'll leave you to it," he said, and went back to his desk. The terms were not punitive. Stewart had been careful about that. Punitive terms would have meant the Whitfields were the problem to be solved, and they weren't, particularly. They were just a different kind of entity, with different interests, and the arrangement would only work if the interests could be genuinely aligned rather than managed. What he asked for was this: minority participation capped at 22%, no board majority, no operational authority, no right of first refusal on future transactions, a 5-year revenue participation with defined exit provisions, and a seat at the table for the employee trust board on any significant capital decision. In exchange, the Whitfields would receive transparent financials, quarterly reporting, and access to the government relations infrastructure that had taken 37 years to build. It was, Carolyn Mercer told Douglas privately, a better deal than it sounded. The minority position in a stable, government-contracted environmental firm with locked-in revenue participation was exactly the kind of low-volatility anchor that Whitfield's broader portfolio needed. She'd been trying to tell him that for 2 months. Douglas had not wanted to hear it then. He heard it now. The signing happened on a Thursday in January, in a conference room in Timmins that had mismatched chairs and a window that rattled when trucks went by. Stewart had not suggested Toronto. Nobody had asked him why. Ruth was there. Terrence was there. 4 other senior staff members who had been on the trust committee since the summer. Carolyn Mercer was there, representing Whitfield's interests. Douglas had sent a junior associate named Peter, which was either a deliberate slight or a practical decision. Stewart found he didn't much care which. Reginald Whitfield sent a handwritten note instead of attending. It was brief, formal, and signed in the careful cursive of an older man who had learned to write before ballpoints were ubiquitous. It said, among other things, that he respected what Stewart had built and that the family looked forward to being a part of it. Stewart thought that might even be true. Reginald was old enough, perhaps, to have grown back into sincerity. After the documents were signed and the lawyer had collected all the copies, Ruth said she wanted to take a photograph. She had brought a camera, an actual camera, not a phone, and she made everyone stand together at the head of the room. "You hate photographs," Terrence told Stewart. "I know," Stewart said. "Then why are you smiling?" Stewart looked at the camera, at Ruth, who was adjusting the focus with a kind of deliberate happiness that she wore rarely but wore completely. "I don't know," he said. "Just am." He drove home afterward, alone. The highway north of Timmins was empty in the way winter highways get, not deserted, just honest. You could see a long way in every direction. Snow had fallen the night before, and the birch trees along the shoulder held it in the forks of their branches, white and precise. He was 59 years old. He had a Subaru with a dented bumper and a binder on his office shelf, and a daughter in Guelph who called every Sunday and was coming to visit in February with Brunswick. Who had never seen real snow and would, Maggie had promised, lose his mind entirely. He thought about Dorothy Price and her handwritten note, and the letter he'd written in 2009 that he barely remembered writing. He thought about Callum's envelope from Prince Edward Island, sitting in a binder next to a soil remediation report from 1993. He thought that sometimes the things you do without thinking about their meaning turn out to be the things that carry the most of it. The highway curved north. The sky was the kind of blue that winter delivers sometimes without warning, absolute, clarifying, with no apology for its depth. Stewart Aldridge drove on into it, unhurried, the heater running quietly, the road ahead exactly as long as it needed to be.